So this is Acts chapter 12, the scripture for June 2nd. Now, other than Stephen, who was a deacon that was martyred in Acts chapter 7, the leaders of the church, the apostles, the deacons, those who were teachers in the church, they've been mostly spared in terms of this persecution. While they may have had to move around a bit, we're not sure, in terms of their lives, they were mostly safe. And this intense persecution led by the Jewish temple leaders hadn't touched them. The deacons and apostles have mostly remained in Jerusalem with some exceptions. They've been coordinating the work of service and evangelism as well as administering the early church from this important centralized city. However, in this chapter, the secular government begins to involve itself in the persecution of the early church as well as the Jewish leaders. It's not just a religious squabble anymore. We hear of a number of King Herods in Jesus' time and the 50 years beyond Jesus' time. There are at least three that we need to be familiar with. There's Herod the Great, who ruled over Judea and that sort of region around the time of Jesus' birth and for some years before that. He was the one who gave the horrific order to slaughter all of the children of Bethlehem when Jesus was born. And that's in Matthew chapter 2. He's the grandfather of the king who's in power now. The king in power now, Herod Agrippa I, was also not a great fella, but he's a different Herod still than the Herod who was king when Jesus was crucified. That was Herod Antipas, who was Herod Agrippa's uncle. I hope that all this is clear as mud. Family names were, I guess, a big deal then as they sometimes are today. So Herod Agrippa I doesn't really seem interested in ruling in order to uphold the law. That's not so much his deal. Instead, he's interested in pleasing his citizens, which is a very different plan of action, and is one where if you're just interested in pleasing your citizens, you're going to get corrupt real quick, because the loudest voices are the ones that you're going to want to please more. It's a poor way to govern. It leads to his arrest of Peter along with his martyring of James. This is James, son of Zebedee, the brother of John, son of Zebedee. Now, Peter's arrest and nearly assured death, I mean, he was guarded by a massive number of guards, and they made sure not to let him get away. I mean, this mirrors very similarly in terms of timing the arrest and death of Jesus Christ. It happens during the festival of unleavened bread during the Passover. However, Peter receives an angelic visitor and is freed. Now, I'm sure Peter wondered why he was freed, why he was given the gift of life when his friend and colleague James was not. We might be wondering the same thing. What's going on with Peter being set free? Is he somehow more important? What's that about? Well, I think that when we receive God's grace, the charge that's given along with God's grace is not to feel either guilty on the one hand or like we're super important on the other. I think that we tend toward both of these reactions, both with survivor's guilt and also with, well, God must really need me. I think that our charge isn't to do either of those things, but instead to recommit ourselves to service, which is in fact what Peter does. He immediately goes back to where the apostles were gathered in prayer for him and knocks on the door. And even when he's abandoned on the threshold of the door by the servant who goes to report his presence back to the apostles, he still tries to knock on the door and get their attention. And then he's not stupid about it. He doesn't go somewhere where the lackeys of the king are going to find him. He then relocates somewhere else so that he can continue to serve God. Now, because Peter escaped, several of those who were guarding him ended up being killed. And I want to be very clear that the responsibility for their deaths lies firmly at the feet of Herod. Herod really just didn't seem to be a very nice fella. After this, upon basking in the praise of the people of Tyre and Sidon, he's struck down. And it says that an angel of the Lord struck him down. And the word used to describe Herod's death is only used in 3 total places in the New Testament. It's used here for Herod, and the other 2 places it's used is in Acts 5 to describe the deaths of Ananias and Sapphira, both of whom committed the same sin that Herod did, which is to try and take glory that ought to be given to God and use it, claim it for themselves. This is very contrary to how Peter works, who humbled himself and kept working for God, risking his life. Instead, Herod sought to exalt himself when he should have humbled himself. Now I wonder, how can you humble yourself in God's sight today? That's all for Acts chapter 12. Tomorrow, the 3rd of June, we'll be looking at Acts chapter 13. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.